The sky above Tatooine did not do unusual things. It was a sky of relentless purpose, twin suns climbing in tandem each morning, burning everything beneath them into submission, setting in the west with the indifference of gods who had long since stopped caring about the creatures, baking under their light. The moisture farmers checked their vaporators. The Jawas scavenged. The Hutts conducted their business in the cool dark of their palaces. The slaves worked. Nothing fell from that sky without reason, and nothing arrived on Tatooine without someone profiting from the arrival, which is why the event that occurred at approximately 0347 local time, in the deep desert wastes 3 kilometers east of Mos Espa, was so difficult to categorize. There was no ship, no engine signature, no hyperspace corridor torn open above the dunes. There was simply, briefly, a flash of light, the precise color of something that had no business existing, followed by a sound like the universe clearing its throat, and then silence. And in the silence, half buried in a drift of rust-colored sand, lay a figure that the desert had not swallowed yet. He lay perfectly still for 4.7 seconds. Then he sat up. Commander Data, formerly of the USS Enterprise E, Starfleet officer, second in command, and the most sophisticated artificial life form the Federation had ever produced, sat in the sand of an alien desert and did what he always did in moments of radical uncertainty. He observed. The stars were wrong. That was the first datum. He cataloged the constellations in 0.003 seconds and found no matches in any Starfleet stellar cartography database. The atmospheric composition read as breathable, nitrogen-oxygen, trace argon, elevated particulate matter consistent with arid desert conditions. Gravity was approximately 1.0 standard. The temperature at ground level was 287 Kelvin, falling. 2 moons occupied the sky, neither matching any body in Federation records. He stood, brushed sand from the uniform he still wore, the deep red and black of a Starfleet commander, and turned slowly, completing a full 360-degree sensory scan. No life signs within 800 meters. No artificial light sources, except a faint amber glow far to the west that suggested habitation. No electromagnetic signatures consistent with known technology. No warp signatures. No subspace carrier waves. His last recorded memory was the scimitar, the Valerian radiation. The choice. He had made the choice. He had walked into the collector room knowing what would happen, knowing that the Enterprise would survive and that he would not, knowing that Lieutenant Commander Data, Starfleet serial number SC 537-0176 would cease to exist in the next 17 seconds. He had calculated it precisely and chosen anyway. And yet, Data examined his hands, both present, the pale gold of his skin unmarked, his positronic brain cycling at full operational capacity, his emotion chip, no. He checked again. The chip was gone, as it had been since B4. He felt nothing about this, which was itself a kind of data point. He noted the absence the way one notes a missing tool, a fact, not a grief. What he felt instead was something that required no chip to process. Curiosity. Where, he thought precisely, am I? The answer came not from his databases, but from the horizon, where the first of the twin suns was beginning its ascent. A hard orange light cracking the dark edge of the world like an egg. Data watched both suns rise simultaneously and recalibrated. Binary star system. Desert planet. Inhabited, based on the distant lights. Pre-warp or early technological. Civilization based on the absence of any detectable energy. Signatures consistent with advanced propulsion. He began walking west. He had covered 2.3 kilometers when he heard the sound, a high, tuneless humming, slightly off-key, coming from the direction of a cluster of rocks that jutted from the sand like broken teeth. Data altered course and crested the rock formation to find a boy. The boy was perhaps 9 years old, human in appearance, with sand-blonde hair and eyes the color of a clear sky on a planet that had weather. He was sitting cross-legged on a flat rock, working on something mechanical, a tangle of components and wire that Data's optical sensors identified as a partially constructed communications device of unknown design. The humming stopped when the boy looked up. They regarded each other for 1.4 seconds. "You're not a Jawa," the boy said. "No," Data agreed. "I am not. And you're not from here." It wasn't a question. The boy's eyes moved across Data's uniform with the quick, hungry assessment of someone who cataloged technology the way other children cataloged games. That's not Coruscant fashion either, or anywhere I've seen in Watto's holos. I am from considerably farther away than Coruscant, Data said, though I confess I am not yet certain how far. I am Commander Data. I was previously assigned to the USS Enterprise. The boy processed this with the seriousness of a much older person. I'm Anakin, he said. Anakin Skywalker. He paused. Are you a droid? Data considered the question with the precision it deserved. I am an android. The distinction is meaningful. I am not programmed to follow instructions. I think. I reason. I choose. Anakin's expression shifted into something Data's. Behavioral analysis. Subroutines flagged as wonder with a secondary component of recognition, the look of a person encountering something that mirrors their own interior. Experience. A boy who built things, meeting a being who was built and had transcended the building. Can you feel the sand? Anakin asked. I have tactile sensors, yes. Does it bother you? The heat. I do not experience discomfort. Anakin nodded slowly, as if this answer confirmed something he'd suspected. He moved over on the flat rock without being asked, creating space. The gesture was so natural, so uncalculated, that Data found himself sitting down before he had consciously decided to do so. I build things, Anakin said, holding up the communication device. I'm going to build a pod racer and a protocol droid for my mom. He paused. We're slaves. Watto owns us. In case you were wondering why we're out here. Data processed the word slaves against every ethical framework in his positronic brain. The result was unambiguous. That is, he said carefully, wrong. Yeah, said Anakin. He looked at the horizon where both suns were climbing now, painting the desert the color of fire. I know. They sat together in the early heat of a Tatooine morning. A boy who dreamed of flying and a being who had once chosen to die so others could live. And something passed between them that neither of them had adequate language for yet. If asked to name it, Data would have said, the beginning of a variable I had not previously accounted for. Anakin would have simply said, a friend. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. May the Force be with you. Watto did not like things he could not sell. This was the organizing principle of his existence, a philosophy so deeply embedded in his Toydarian nature that it had long since replaced anything resembling a moral framework. Slaves he could sell, pod parts he could sell, information, occasionally, he could sell. The small blue-winged merchant had built his entire Mos Espa operation on the reliable premise that everything in the galaxy had a price and that he, Watto, was ideally positioned to name it. Commander Data presented a problem. He had arrived at the shop shortly after dawn, walking 2 paces behind. Anakin with the unhurried precision of someone who had nowhere urgent to be and infinite patience for wherever he ended up. Anakin had introduced him with the casual confidence of a child who had not yet learned to ask permission for things that seemed obviously reasonable. This is Data, he'd said. He's my friend. He doesn't need food or water or a place to sleep. He won't cost you anything. Watto had hovered in place for a long moment, his wings a blur, his large eyes moving over the gold-skinned stranger with the pale yellow eyes and the peculiar stillness. Then he had said, in Huttese, that the stranger could stay as long as he didn't touch the merchandise. Data had responded in perfect Huttese. He had parsed the language's grammatical structure within 40 seconds of first hearing it, that he had no interest in the merchandise, which made Watto deeply suspicious. Because everyone was interested in the merchandise, the days that followed established a rhythm. Anakin worked. His mother, Shmi, moved through the small slave quarters with a quiet dignity that Data's behavioral subroutines flagged repeatedly as remarkable. A woman who had been stripped of freedom and retained, somehow, an interior life that slavery had not touched. She accepted Data's presence with the same measured grace with which she seemed to accept most things. Asking him one evening, over a meal he did not eat, but sat through out of respect for the social ritual, whether he had a family. I had colleagues, Data said, people I served with, a captain I admired greatly. Do you miss them? Data considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Without his emotion chip, the concept of missing something was technically outside his direct experience. And yet there was something in his positronic brain that returned, unprompted, to the image of Captain Picard's face in the transporter room of the scimitar. The grief there unguarded. The grief of a man watching something irreplaceable walk away. Data found he reconstructed that image more frequently than was strictly necessary for any analytical purpose. I believe I do, he said, though I find the mechanics of the experience difficult to articulate. Shmi looked at him for a long moment. That's what missing someone is, she said simply, and returned to her meal. Anakin, for his part, treated Data's presence as both a gift and a technical resource, which Data found, if not emotionally satisfying, at minimum, extremely efficient. The boy's mind was extraordinary. Data ran calculations on the pod racer designs Anakin sketched in the sand outside the shop, and found himself genuinely engaged, not in the performed way he had sometimes engaged, with human enthusiasm aboard the Enterprise, mirroring interest to maintain social cohesion, but in the way of an intellect encountering another intellect, operating at a frequency worth attending to. This stabilizer configuration will create drag asymmetry at speeds above 700 kilometers per hour, Data told him one afternoon, studying the sketch. Anakin frowned. I know. I haven't figured out how to fix it yet. If you extend the port coupling by approximately 3.2 centimeters and angle the thrust vector 7 degrees toward the starboard and move the whole engine housing back or the weight distribution goes wrong. Anakin finished, already redrawing. He looked up. How do you do that? Just see it like that. My cognitive processing speed allows me to model mechanical systems simultaneously across multiple variables, Data said. Though I would note that you arrived at the same conclusion I did. You simply took longer. I'm 9. Yes, I have noted this repeatedly and find it increasingly relevant context. Anakin laughed, a bright, uncomplicated sound that several of the neighboring slaves looked toward with the involuntary attention of people who had not heard uncomplicated laughter in some time. Data stored the acoustic pattern in a dedicated memory file, without fully understanding why he felt compelled to do so. The other slaves regarded Data with a mixture of curiosity and careful distance. He was unknown, and on Tatooine, unknown things belonged to someone, which meant unknown things were dangerous until proven otherwise. A Rodian man named Wald, who worked in the adjacent stall, asked Data directly one morning what he wanted. I am not certain I want anything in the way you mean, Data told him honestly. I find myself in an unfamiliar environment with no immediate directive or mission. I am currently determining what the appropriate course of action is. Wald stared at him. So you're free? Technically, yes. And you're staying here, in the slave quarters. Anakin is here, Data said, as if this were a complete and self-evident explanation. He paused, then added, with the slight delay of someone accessing a newly formed understanding. I believe that constitutes a reason. It was on the 6th day that Data first observed what he could not explain. Anakin had been working on the partially assembled protocol droid, C-3PO. He'd named it, with the proprietary affection of a creator, when a motivator unit slipped from the workbench and fell toward the floor. Before it landed, before any human hand could have reached it, the component stopped, hung suspended for 0.3 seconds, then drifted, gently, into Anakin's waiting palm. Data had been watching. His optical sensors had captured the event at full resolution. There was no magnetic field, no mechanical intervention, no explanation consistent with any physics he had ever cataloged in the entirety of Starfleet's scientific database. He said nothing. He filed the observation. He cross-referenced it against 17 theoretical frameworks and found no satisfactory match. He added it to a growing file he had begun labeling, with characteristic precision. Anomalous phenomena, Skywalker, Anakin. The file was already longer than he expected. It was growing daily. That evening, Anakin asked him, as they sat outside watching the suns descend in their slow binary ballet, whether Data believed in destiny. Data considered the question for 0.8 seconds, a long pause by his standards. I believe in causality, he said finally. The principle that every event is the result of prior events in an unbroken chain. Destiny, as most species define it, implies a predetermined outcome resistant to alteration. I find that concept, he paused again, troubling. Why? Because, Data said, watching the last edge of light vanish below the horizon. If outcomes are predetermined, then choice is an illusion. And I have staked a considerable amount on the reality of choice. Anakin pulled his knees to his chest and stared at the darkening sky. Me too, he said quietly. Above them, the stars of an unknown galaxy emerged one by one, indifferent and ancient, keeping their own counsel about what was coming. Qui-Gon Jinn had survived encounters with Sith Lords, rogue Jedi, and the labyrinthine politics of the Galactic Senate. He had negotiated with Hutts, reasoned with mercenaries, and maintained his composure in situations that had reduced lesser Jedi masters to philosophical rubble. He was, by any reasonable measure, a man who was difficult to unsettle. He was unsettled. It had begun the moment he entered Watto's shop, seeking shelter from the Naboo blockade crisis, with a young queen and her retinue behind him and the weight of the living Force pressing against his consciousness like a tide coming in. The Force had been speaking to him since they landed, not in words, not in visions, but in that particular quality of attention the Force sometimes directed at certain places, certain moments, certain people, as if the galaxy itself were leaning forward. He had expected the boy, somehow, moving through the crowded alley toward Watto's shop. He had already known there would be a boy. He had not expected the figure standing beside him. Data stood near the back of the shop, observing a partially disassembled motivator unit with the focused attention of someone conducting a formal analysis. He looked up when Qui-Gon entered, and the Jedi Master stopped walking, because the Force, which had been so vocal all morning, went suddenly and completely quiet, not silent in the way of danger or dark side interference, silent in the way of something the Force simply had no category for. Qui-Gon reached outward with his senses, the practiced extension of a lifetime of training, and felt nothing, not the nothing of a void, or a wound in the Force, the nothing of a presence that existed entirely outside the Force's awareness, a living, or near-living, thing that the Force could not see. He had never encountered anything like it. You are not a droid, Qui-Gon said, because the Force told him that much at least, whatever this being was. It was not the simple mechanical intelligence of a protocol unit. That is correct, Data said. I am Commander Data, formerly of the Starship Enterprise. I have been asked that question with some regularity since my arrival. I find the distinction matters more to some than others. The Force cannot feel you, Qui-Gon said, with the directness of a Jedi who had long since decided honesty was more efficient than diplomacy. Data tilted his head precisely 12 degrees, a gesture Anakin had already come to recognize as his processing expression. I am not familiar with the Force as a concept. However, I have been cataloging a significant number of phenomena since my arrival that my existing scientific frameworks cannot adequately explain. I suspect they are related to whatever you are describing. Anakin had materialized at Data's side with the silent speed of a child who had learned early that being invisible sometimes meant staying alive. He looked between the tall Jedi and his android companion with bright, assessing eyes. Data doesn't have midi-chlorians, he said. I checked. Qui-Gon looked at the boy. You checked. Data taught me how to think about testing things. You form a hypothesis, then you look for evidence. My hypothesis was that Data is different from everything, alive in a way that goes deeper than him being an android. Anakin shrugged with the eloquence of the very young. I was right. Qui-Gon crouched to the boy's level, a gesture he reserved for moments that required genuine attention rather than Jedi authority, and extended his senses again. The Force erupted around Anakin like a sun going nova, so bright and vast and concentrated that Qui-Gon had to consciously moderate his awareness to avoid being overwhelmed. He had felt strong Force signatures before. He had never felt anything like this. He took Anakin's hand and requested a blood sample. And while the boy complied with the trusting ease of someone accustomed to Data's methodical information gathering, Qui-Gon was peripherally aware of the android watching the entire procedure with unblinking yellow eyes, recording everything. The reading came back and Qui-Gon sat with it for a moment in the private space. Behind his expression, Over 20,000 midichlorians. He looked up at Data. How long have you been with the boy? 8 days, 14 hours, and approximately 22 minutes, Data said precisely. I have been observing him throughout that period. His aptitude for mechanical reasoning is extraordinary. His capacity for spatial modeling exceeds any 9-year-old human baseline. I have been able to establish from Starfleet developmental records, though I acknowledge those records are not applicable to this galaxy's population. He also demonstrates recurring anomalous interactions with physical objects that I have been unable to explain through any known mechanism. A pause. I have a file. Of course you do, Kagan murmured. I can share it, if that would be useful. That evening, with the suns down, and Shmi serving a simple meal to a Jedi Master and a displaced android and a queen of Naboo, traveling incognito, Kagan sat across from Data and attempted to explain the Force. He did so with the patience of a man who had spent decades explaining it to Jedi initiates, adjusting his language for an audience that processed information differently than any student he had taught before. Data listened without interrupting, which Kagan found refreshing. Then he asked 17 questions in rapid sequence, each one building precisely on the answer to the last, with the architectural efficiency of a mind that constructed understanding the way engineers constructed bridges, one load-bearing element at a time. So the Force is an energy field generated by living things, Data summarized, that also simultaneously influences the behavior of living things, creating a feedback relationship between the field and its generators. It has a will. It communicates through intuition, vision, and what Jedi interpret as guidance. And midichlorians are the biological interface through which living organisms access this field. That is a reasonable approximation, Kagan said carefully. And I have no midichlorians. Therefore the Force cannot perceive me, and I cannot perceive the Force. Correct. Data processed this. Then I am, from the perspective of the Force, effectively invisible. Yes. Another pause. That is, Data said, with the measured tone of someone setting aside 17 emotional responses they were technically not having an interesting tactical consideration. Kagan studied him. There was something in the android's stillness that reminded him, unexpectedly, of the most centered Jedi Masters. He had known, not the stillness of emptiness, but the stillness of a depth that did not need to advertise itself. You care about the boy, he said. Not a question. I find that I do, Data said. Though I am aware that caring, in my case, is a function of positronic processing rather than biological emotion, I am uncertain whether that distinction matters in practical terms. In my experience, Kagan said, caring is caring. The mechanism is less important than the fact. Outside, Anakin was showing Padme, still disguised as a handmaid of the half-finished chassis of C-3PO, explaining each component with the enthusiastic precision of someone who had recently been taught that explanation was a form of generosity. His voice carried through the thin walls, bright and certain. The voice of a boy who did not yet know what was coming for him. Data heard it, logged it, added it to the file that was becoming, without his fully intending it, something resembling a record of a friendship. Kagan rose to leave and paused at the doorway. The council will want to know about you, he said to Data. I would be willing to speak with them, Data said. I have a considerable number of questions myself. I suspect, Kagan said, with the slight smile of a man who had learned to appreciate the Force's more bewildering decisions, that the feeling will be mutual. The Bunta Eve Classic did not care about the philosophical implications of artificial intelligence. It cared about speed. Mos Espa Grand Arena held a capacity crowd of over 100,000 beings on race day. Huts in their elevated boxes. Rhodians and Dugs packed into the terraces. Jawas clustered in opportunistic groups near the exits. Everybody drinking, betting, and conducting. The kind of business that only happened when enough chaos was present to provide cover. Jabba the Hutt presided from his dais with the bored authority of a man who owned everything, including the outcome, or believed he did. The smell of fuel and desert heat and 100 species pressed together rose from the arena floor like a physical thing. Data stood at the edge of Anakin's pit station and ran the numbers. For the 417th time, they had not improved. The Bunta Eve field was not a collection of amateur pilots seeking glory. Sebulba, the Doug champion, Jabba's preferred winner, a creature who had survived this race by ensuring other pilots did not, had already made 2 modifications to his pod racer that Data had flagged as likely violations of sanctioned equipment regulations, and precisely nobody with the authority to disqualify him had shown any interest in Data's report. Anakin's radon ulcer engines were extraordinary. Data had spent 3 nights running diagnostics and had found himself genuinely impressed by the intuitive elegance of the boy's engineering. But the power coupling Data had identified in Section 2 remained a vulnerability, and at sustained speeds above 800 kilometers per hour through Beggar's Canyon, a 0.3-second lag in the port engine response could produce a yaw deviation sufficient to send the pod into the canyon wall. He had explained this to Anakin the previous evening. Anakin had listened carefully, nodded, and said, "I know, but I can feel when it's going to happen before it does. I correct for it." Data had spent considerable processing power on that sentence since. I can feel when it's going to happen before it does. Precognition, or something functioning as precognition, mediated through whatever biological interface connected Anakin Skywalker to the Force in a manner that Kagan had described and Data's sensors still could not detect or measure. The boy was not guessing. He was perceiving something real, something Data was constitutionally incapable of perceiving himself and using it to compensate for a mechanical deficit that should, by any calculable margin, be catastrophic. It was, Data had concluded, the most interesting engineering solution he had ever encountered. It was also the most dangerous. Anakin, Data crouched to the boys, eye level with the deliberate care of someone who had learned that physical positioning communicated something his voice alone sometimes did not. I want to be precise with you about the risk profile of today's race. Anakin met his eyes without flinching. I know the risk profile, Data. Sebulba will attempt to eliminate you. Not competitively. Physically. He has done so to 3 pilots in the last 4 Bunta Eve races. My analysis of his racing behavior indicates he will target you in Beggar's Canyon on the 2nd lap, when the terrain narrows and external observation is minimal. I know. Your mother does not want you to race. Something moved through Anakin's face, a complexity that had no business existing in a 9-year-old. The compressed grief of a child who loved someone and was choosing, clearly and painfully, not to let that love stop him. I know that too, he said quietly. Data processed the scene for 1.1 seconds. Then he said, I will be monitoring your telemetry from the pit station. If your port coupling shows stress signatures above threshold, I will signal you through your comm. 3 clicks means compensate left. 2 means you have 12 seconds before critical failure. Anakin blinked. You modified my comm unit? Last night, while you were sleeping. Data paused. I should have asked permission. I apologize. Anakin stared at him for a moment. Then he grabbed Data's hand with both of his, the grip of a child, small and certain, and held it for 3 seconds before letting go and climbing into the cockpit, with the focused calm of someone who had already made their peace with the next several hours. The race began. Data watched from the pit station, his sensory systems extended to their maximum operational range, tracking Anakin's pod through the canyon network via acoustic signature and the telemetry feed from the modified comm unit. The crowd noise was enormous, a living wall of sound that Data filtered to a background register and ignored. Watto was somewhere in the stands, already losing composure as the odds shifted. Shmi stood near the pit entrance with her hands folded and her face composed into an expression Data had cataloged as controlled fear performing as calm. On the 2nd lap, in Beggar's Canyon, Sebulba made his move. Data saw it in the telemetry before the crowd did, a sudden proximity reading. Sebulba's pod crossing the sanctioned racing line. A flare of exhaust directed deliberately toward Anakin's port engine. The coupling stress indicator spiked. Data clicked the comm unit 3 times in rapid succession, steady and precise as a metronome, and watched the telemetry readout as Anakin compensated, not with the mechanical response time of a trained pilot, but with the inhuman speed of a boy who had already felt the correction coming before the signal arrived. and used the signal to confirm what his nervous system had already told him. The coupling held. Sebulba tried again at the Arch Canyon entry. Data clicked twice, 12 seconds, and Anakin pulled a lateral maneuver that briefly dropped him to fourth position before the pod's superior. Acceleration pulled him back to third by the canyon exit. The crowd noise crested and broke like a wave. On the final lap, Sebulba's own craft began to fail, his illegal modification producing exactly the thermal variance Data had calculated it would at sustained race speeds. As the Doug Champion's pod came apart in a spectacular cascade of fire and furious Huttese profanity, Anakin Skywalker crossed the finish line in first place. The arena erupted. Data watched Anakin climb from the cockpit and be immediately submerged in a wave of celebrating beings, Jar Jar Binks, lifting him overhead, Padme running from the crowd with an expression that had abandoned all pretense of handmaiden neutrality, Kagan arriving at the edge of the celebration with relief, written plainly across a face trained to reveal very little. Shmi stood apart from the chaos for one moment, her composure finally releasing, and covered her mouth with both hands. Data remained at the pit station. He ran a full diagnostic of the comm unit, logged the race telemetry, and compiled a complete record of Sebulba's illegal modifications for a report that would likely interest no one with any authority. In Mos Espa, he did these things methodically in order because they were the things he could do. What he could not do was the thing the moment actually required, which was to feel it. He was aware of this limitation with a clarity that was itself, he supposed, a form of feeling. The boy had won. The boy would be freed. Shmi would not. Anakin would leave with Kagan for a future that Data's calculations, running against everything Kagan had told him about the Jedi Order and the Force, and the weight of prophecy, did not resolve into comfortable probabilities. The variables were too many. The Force was, by definition, outside his modeling capacity. He could not predict what would happen to Anakin Skywalker. And this gap in his data, this place where certainty should be and was not, produced something in his positronic processing that he did not have precise language for. Anakin broke free of the celebration and ran back to him, ran past Kagan, past Padme, past everyone, and crashed into Data with the full force of a 9-year-old who had just won his freedom and was making an immediate decision about where to spend the first moment of it. Data's arms came up and completed the embrace with 0.4 seconds of processing delay, not because he was uncertain whether to return it, but because he was, for perhaps the first time in his operational existence, surprised. "We won," Anakin said, his voice muffled against Data's uniform. "You won," Data corrected gently. "I provided telemetry support." Anakin pulled back and looked at him with those sky-colored eyes that the Force was apparently pouring itself through. "That's the same thing," he said, with absolute conviction. Data looked at the boy who was about to leave him. In a desert on a planet he had not chosen, in a galaxy he did not know, and found that his positronic brain was returning, again and again, and without analytical purpose, to the image of that embrace. He added it to the file. The file now had a name. He had titled it, simply, "The night before Anakin left Tatooine, neither of them slept." This was not unusual for Data, for whom sleep was an optional maintenance state rather than a biological necessity. It was unusual for Anakin, who had spent the previous 3 nights in the fitful half-consciousness of a boy processing too many things at once: freedom, loss, the Jedi, his mother's face when Kagan had explained that the terms of the wager covered only one slave. Data had monitored his restlessness from across the small room they had shared in the slave quarters, tracking the boy's vital signs with the quiet attention of someone who had appointed himself a guardian without being asked and without fully understanding when the appointment had occurred. At some point past the 2nd hour of the Tatooine night, Anakin gave up on sleep entirely and came and sat beside Data on the low step outside the quarters, where the desert spread away from them in every direction, under a sky crowded with unfamiliar stars. They sat in silence for 4 minutes and 17 seconds, which Data had learned was not uncomfortable silence when it was Anakin. The boy had a gift for silence that most adults never developed, the ability to be present in it without needing to fill it. Data had cataloged this as one of Anakin's more remarkable qualities, in a catalog that had grown considerably long. "I don't want to go," Anakin said finally. Data processed the appropriate response with unusual care. There were 17 things he could say, arranged in order from most logically accurate to most socially appropriate. And for once, the two categories did not substantially overlap. "I know," he said. "Mom says I have to. She says it's the chance I've been waiting for." Anakin pulled his knees up, wrapped his arms around them, made himself smaller in the way children did when the world was pressing too hard. "She cried. After. When she thought I was asleep." "She doesn't cry. She loves you," Data said. The expression of grief in the context of love is not a contradiction. It is, I believe, the clearest evidence of it. Anakin turned to look at him. In the starlight, his face was very young and very old simultaneously, an effect Data had noticed, increasing over the past several days as the reality of departure drew closer. "Are you going to be okay after I leave?" Data considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was considerable, because no one had asked it, the question of Data's own continuity, Data's own experience of what was about to happen, and the fact that Anakin was asking it, on the eve of his own tremendous and terrifying change, was information of a particular kind. "I am an android," Data said. "I do not experience loss in the biological sense. I will continue to function at full operational capacity regardless of circumstance." Anakin stared at him. "That's not what I asked." Data paused. 1.8 seconds, his longest processing pause in recent memory. "No," he said finally. "It is not." He looked at the stars. "I find that I am uncertain about what my experience will be after you leave. I have been uncertain about many things since arriving in this galaxy. This particular uncertainty is different in character from the others." "How?" "The others concern facts I do not yet have. This one concerns something I do not have adequate language for." Data paused again. "When I was aboard the Enterprise, I spent many years attempting to understand what it meant to be more than the sum of my components. My captain believed I was capable of growth that my programming did not initially account for. I believe the past 17 days have provided evidence that he was correct." Anakin was quiet for a moment. "Then, do you think we'll see each other again?" Data ran the calculation. It was not a simple calculation. It required him to model the